Almost immediately after Henry VIII laid eyes on the portrait of Anne of Cleves, he decided she would be his next queen. And for centuries, we've been told the same punchline to this story, that when they finally met, his stomach turned, his desire evaporated, and he found her so unattractive he could barely stand to be in the same room. Anne of Cleves, history says, was the ugly wife, the rejected queen, the marital mistake so embarrassing it barely lasted 6 months. But that version of events is suspiciously convenient, especially coming from a king who spent his life rewriting reality to suit his ego. Because when you strip away the insults, the gossip, and the carefully preserved Tudor propaganda, a far more disturbing question emerges. What if Anne wasn't rejected at all? What if Henry was the one who felt rejected first? According to some accounts, the moment that doomed this marriage didn't happen at the altar or in the bedchamber, but in a quiet room in Rochester, when a disguised king tried to stage a romantic surprise, and the woman he intended to rule simply didn't react the way he expected. And if that's true, then Anne's real crime had nothing to do with her face and everything to do with bruising the most dangerous ego in England. To understand how this marriage imploded so spectacularly, you have to understand the political pressure cooker Henry VIII was living in by the late 1530s. Because this wasn't a love story, it was an alliance born of fear, desperation, and religious warfare. Henry had already torn England away from the Catholic Church, publicly humiliated the Pope, executed Anne Boleyn, and watched Europe eye him like a dangerous heretic king who might need to be dealt with sooner rather than later. He needed Protestant allies, and he needed them fast, and that's where Anne of Cleves came in. Her family, particularly her father, John, Duke of Cleves, had a reputation for being stubborn, reform-minded, and openly hostile to papal authority, which made Anne politically useful, but personally risky. This was not a family that bowed easily to kings, and Anne herself had been raised in a household dominated by women, marked by modesty, restraint, and an almost aggressively unglamorous sense of propriety. According to contemporary descriptions, her upbringing discouraged flirtation, performance, and courtly games, the very skills Henry expected his queens to master effortlessly. Meanwhile, Henry was older, heavier, chronically insecure, and obsessed with being admired, desired, and validated, especially by women who were supposed to see him as the center of the universe. This marriage was arranged before Anne ever set foot in England, negotiated by men who treated her less like a person and more like a diplomatic instrument. And Henry's first real connection to his future wife wasn't her voice, her personality, or her intelligence, but a painting. In one of the creepier episodes of royal matchmaking, Henry sent his court painter, Hans Holbein, to Cleves with explicit instructions to paint Anne accurately and without flattery, because the king allegedly wanted the truth. Historians later pointed out how strange this excuse is, because it directly contradicts the popular myth that Henry was tricked by an overly generous portrait. Holbein was known for realism, and Henry specifically told him not to beautify the subject. Yet when the portrait returned, Henry approved the match almost immediately. That suggests the decision had less to do with physical attraction and far more to do with politics, inheritance, and timing. Anne was the elder sister. She carried greater dynastic weight, and marrying her secured an alliance Henry couldn't afford to lose. Still, as any modern dating disaster will tell you, chemistry doesn't travel through paint and canvas, and when Anne finally arrived in England, the fantasy Henry had built in his head collided violently with reality. The most infamous moment came on New Year's Day 1540, when Anne's party stopped at Rochester, and Henry decided to test fate, romance, and possibly Anne herself. According to several accounts, Henry disguised himself and entered the room where Anne was watching bear baiting from a window, expecting some sort of storybook reaction, recognition through destiny, or at the very least, delighted interest. Instead, what happened was painfully anticlimactic. Depending on the source, Anne either politely ignored this strange burly man who approached her without introduction, or she became actively uncomfortable when he tried to touch her, prompting her to call for help. Either way, she did not swoon, she did not flirt, and she did not validate Henry's fantasy. The king left the encounter furious, embarrassed, and possibly humiliated, and historians have long suspected this was the moment his attitude toward Anne hardened beyond repair. Because from that point forward, the narrative shifts dramatically. Henry suddenly began complaining about Anne's appearance, muttering that she was nothing so fair as she had been reported, quietly blaming Holbein, then publicly blaming his chief minister Thomas Cromwell, who had championed the match. The insults escalated after the wedding, with Henry claiming he liked her much worse after their first night together, a statement that sounds less like disappointment and more like punishment. He accused her of smelling bad, of being unappealing, of failing him as a wife, all while carefully insisting that the marriage had never been consummated, because even in rejection, Henry needed to protect his own masculinity. According to records from the annulment proceedings, he went so far as to summon a physician to testify that he was perfectly capable of sexual function, citing nocturnal emissions as evidence, an absurdly intimate detail that turned the entire trial into a grotesque performance. The goal was clear. Henry needed to erase this marriage without admitting failure, and Anne became the scapegoat for a political decision he could no longer tolerate. Yet this was not a simple discard and destroy situation, because Anne, unlike Henry's other wives, understood the danger she was in. She did not fight the annulment, she did not protest, and she did not challenge the king's version of events. Instead, she agreed, cooperated, and survived. In exchange, she received an extraordinary settlement, estates, income, and a unique status as the king's beloved sister, ranking higher than almost every woman in England, except Henry's current wife and daughters. It was a quiet victory in a court littered with severed heads, but even survival didn't mean safety, because rumors followed Anne long after the marriage ended. In late 1541, whispers began circulating that she had secretly given birth to a child, with some even claiming the baby was Henry's. The allegations were almost certainly false, but that didn't stop the Crown from launching an investigation, detaining people who repeated the rumor and reasserting control over Anne's narrative. At the same time, Henry was already betraying her again, chasing his next wife, Catherine Howard, marrying her weeks after the annulment, and then executing her less than 2 years later when she fell from favor. During that collapse, Henry lashed out at Anne one final time, ordering her to return a ring Catherine had given her, a petty act that revealed how much emotional power he still believed he held over her. According to some historians, Anne even briefly entertained the hope that after Catherine Howard's execution, she might remarry Henry, believing that her loyalty and discretion had proven her worth, but that door closed when he chose Catherine Parr instead. And yet, Anne continued to play the long game, cultivating relationships with Henry's children, sending gifts, learning English, and positioning herself carefully within the shifting power structure. That strategy paid off. She lived comfortably through the reigns of Edward VI and Mary I, likely attended Mary's coronation, and when she died in 1557, she was buried in Westminster Abbey, the only one of Henry's wives to receive that honor, her tomb still identifying her as Queen of England despite the annulment. Which brings us back to the question history has spent centuries dodging. If Anne of Cleves was truly so repulsive, so unbearable, so humiliating a mistake, why did Henry treat her better than almost every other woman he married? Why did he preserve her rank, her income, her safety, and her legacy? And why does the story hinge so obsessively on her appearance when the timeline suggests the real rupture occurred the moment she failed to recognize and adore him on command? According to modern historians, Anne's greatest defense may not have been how she looked, but how little she played along, how calmly she refused to perform desire for a man who demanded it as proof of his worth. In a court built on spectacle, flattery, and fear, Anne's quiet restraint may have been interpreted as rejection, and Henry, incapable of tolerating that, rewrote the story to make himself the victim and her the problem. Anne of Cleves is remembered as the ugly queen, the unwanted wife, the mistake that didn't last. But perhaps the more unsettling truth is that she was the one woman who escaped Henry VIII, not because he rejected her, but because she survived him. and history is still uncomfortable admitting that sometimes the most dangerous thing a woman could do in Tudor England was simply not be impressed.